in the basement of the Soviet embassy in Tehran on November 30th, 1943. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov's pen trembled above an operational report that would never see the light of day in any official Soviet document. The words he hesitated to write contained a truth that would shake the very foundation of Soviet wartime mythology. Without the 400,000 trucks we are receiving from the Americans, this offensive would be impossible. We are moving our armies on American wheels. Through the embassy's frosted windows, the distant rumble of American-built Studebaker engines echoed through Tehran's ancient streets, carrying Soviet supplies for the momentous conference where Stalin would sit alongside Roosevelt and Churchill. In that dimly lit room, the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commander confronted a reality that would remain buried in classified archives for nearly half a century. The Red Army that was systematically pushing the Wehrmacht back toward Berlin was rolling on American trucks, burning American fuel, and eating American food. Without this aid, as Stalin himself would privately admit in a toast just hours later, the Soviet Union would have lost the war. The numbers were staggering. 427,284 American trucks and jeeps would cross the treacherous Arctic convoys, navigate the Persian corridor, and traverse the Pacific route into Soviet hands. This represented more vehicles than the Soviet Union had produced during the entire war, more trucks than most nations possessed in their entirety. These machines would transform the Red Army from a force that moved at the speed of marching men and horses into a mechanized avalanche capable of sustaining operations across 1,000-mile fronts. What none of the Soviet officers present that day in Tehran could have imagined was that their private admissions about American aid were being carefully recorded, not just by American stenographers, but by their own NKVD agents, creating a secret record that would contradict decades of Soviet propaganda about the Great Patriotic War. The truth about Soviet transportation began with catastrophe. On June 22, 1941, when 3.8 million Axis soldiers crashed across the Soviet frontier in Operation Barbarossa, they found a Red Army woefully unprepared for mechanized warfare. The Soviet truck fleet, numbering approximately 700,000 vehicles, consisted primarily of the Gaz-AA, a licensed copy of the 1930 Ford Model A, and the ZIS-5, based on 1920s American designs that were already obsolete when the war began. Within 6 months, 40% of this fleet lay destroyed or captured in the smoking ruins of the Soviet Union's western territories. The numbers told a story of industrial inadequacy that Soviet propaganda would spend decades trying to hide. In 1941 alone, the Soviet Union produced just 124,176 trucks, while losing nearly 300,000 to German attacks, mechanical failures, and the chaos of retreat. The Gaz factory in Gorky, the nation's primary truck manufacturer, had to be evacuated eastward as German forces approached, cutting production to a mere trickle. The ZIS factory in Moscow converted entirely to tank production as the Wehrmacht stood at the city's gates, their artillery audible in Red Square. By early 1942, entire Soviet armies moved on foot while their artillery was pulled by horses, when horses could be found at all. The Second Shock Army, trapped in the Volkhov Pocket, lost 95% of its transport in a desperate attempt to break out of German encirclement. Soldiers carried shells on their backs for guns they could no longer move, their faces etched with the exhaustion of men fighting a modern war with medieval logistics. This was the Red Army that American aid would transform, though it would take Soviet leaders 40 years to publicly acknowledge the transformation. The Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads had demonstrated with brutal efficiency what modern warfare required: mobility, speed, and reliable logistics. Soviet forces, despite their numerical superiority in many categories, found themselves outmaneuvered and encircled repeatedly because they simply couldn't match German mobility. Infantry divisions that should have been motorized marched on foot across the endless steppes. Artillery batteries that needed prime movers relied on horses that died by the thousands in the merciless Russian winter, their frozen carcasses littering the roads to Moscow. On October 1, 1941, in the frozen darkness of Arkhangelsk port in the Soviet Arctic, the British convoy PQ-1 discharged its precious cargo. 20 American trucks, the very first of what would become a flood, rolled onto Soviet soil with a rumble that seemed to promise salvation. These Chevrolets, with their enclosed cabs and reliable engines, seemed like mechanical miracles to Soviet drivers accustomed to vehicles that required hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. By November 1941, when the Wehrmacht stood just 12 miles from the Kremlin and Moscow's citizens could hear the thunder of German artillery, American trucks were already arriving at a rate of 2,000 per month through multiple routes that spanned half the globe. The Persian Corridor, managed by American engineers who had taken over the Iranian State Railway, increased its capacity by an astounding 600%. The Pacific route, though limited to non-military supplies due to Soviet-Japanese neutrality, still moved thousands of vehicles across the vast Pacific. The dangerous Arctic convoys, despite heavy losses to U-boat and Luftwaffe attacks, continued to deliver their precious cargo through waters that had become graveyards for merchant ships. The vehicles themselves represented a technological leap that Soviet mechanics could barely comprehend. The Studebaker US-6 featured six-wheel drive with all six wheels powered, compared to only four wheels on Soviet trucks, with just two powered wheels struggling for traction in the mud. The American engine produced 94 horsepower versus the ZIS-5's anemic 73 horsepower. Most critically, the American trucks came equipped with self-recovery winches, allowing them to pull themselves from mud that would trap Soviet vehicles until the spring thaw. These trucks came fully equipped with tools that Soviet forces had never seen in their wildest dreams. Complete 128-piece toolkits, hydraulic jacks that actually worked, tire repair equipment that could fix problems rather than just patch them temporarily, and spare parts catalogs with numbered components that made maintenance a science rather than an art of improvisation. A Soviet truck came with basic hand tools, if it came with tools at all. The Americans had thought of everything: cold weather starting equipment that functioned in Siberian temperatures, cabin heaters that actually produced warmth, sealed electrical systems that didn't short out in wet conditions. The Tehran Conference of November 28 to December 1, 1943, produced one of the most extraordinary admissions in Soviet history, though it would remain classified in American archives until 1961 and unpublished in the Soviet Union until 1989. During a private dinner on November 30th, with only Roosevelt, Churchill, and their closest advisors present, Stalin rose for a toast that directly contradicted everything Soviet propaganda would claim for the next half-century. According to Charles Bolin, Roosevelt's interpreter, Stalin declared with the bluntness that characterized his private conversations, "I want to tell you what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States have done for victory in this war. The most important things in this war are the machines. The United States has proven that it can turn out from 8,000 to 10,000 airplanes per month. Russia can only turn out at most 3,000 airplanes a month. The United States, therefore, is a country of machines. Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, recorded in his diary that Stalin had specifically emphasized trucks during the technical discussions that followed. The Soviet leader stated that the American Studebakers were the best trucks in the world for our conditions and called them the foundation of Soviet mobility. Yet just 3 years later, in 1946, Stalin would publicly declare that Lend-Lease had been merely supplementary and represented only about 10% of Soviet production. This lie would become Soviet orthodoxy, enforced by censors and historians who knew the truth but valued their careers and lives more than historical accuracy. The Tehran Conference records also revealed other crucial admissions that would never appear in Soviet histories. Marshal Zhukov told American logistics officers with stark honesty, "Your trucks are winning the war for us. One American truck is worth 10 light tanks to us." This from a military leader who would publicly credit only Soviet industry with victory for the rest of his life. To understand why American trucks proved so decisive, one must grasp the brutal arithmetic of Soviet logistics. A single Soviet rifle division in attack required 450 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and the 1,000 other necessities of modern warfare. In defense, it needed 300 tons. A tank corps required 1,000 tons daily. Moving these supplies from railheads to the front lines across the Soviet Union's primitive road network required trucks and lots of them. Major General Andrei Krylev, chief of Soviet military logistics, compiled statistics in 1943 that remained classified until 1991. His report revealed the stark mathematics of survival. The Red Army required a minimum of 450,000 trucks for sustained offensive operations. Soviet production from January to September 1943 totaled just 49,000 vehicles. American deliveries in the same period, 94,000 vehicles. Without American vehicles, Soviet forces could not operate beyond 50 kilometers from rail lines, effectively chaining them to fixed positions while the Germans maneuvered freely. The qualitative difference mattered as much as quantity. Soviet trucks, primarily the ZIS-5 and GAZ-AAA, had cargo capacities of 2.5 to 3 tons, but rarely carried more than 1.5 tons on front roads without breaking down. American Studebaker US-6s, rated at 2.5 tons, routinely carried 5 tons on good roads and 3 tons cross-country. Their mean time between failures was 10,000 kilometers compared to 2,000 for Soviet trucks, meaning American vehicles stayed in service 5 times longer. The mechanical superiority extended far beyond mere reliability. American trucks featured innovations that Soviet designers hadn't even imagined. Air brakes that worked in any weather, aluminum pistons that reduced engine weight while increasing power, oil filters that actually filtered contaminants rather than just settling them, thermostats that maintained optimal engine temperature in conditions ranging from Arctic cold to desert heat. Soviet trucks had mechanical brakes that failed when wet, cast iron pistons that added unnecessary weight, settling tanks that rarely worked effectively, and engines that ran too cold in winter and overheated in summer. While Arctic convoys captured public imagination with their desperate battles against German U-boats, the Persian Corridor quietly became the primary route for American trucks reaching Soviet forces. This 4,000-mile supply line from American ports through Iran to the Soviet border represented one of the greatest logistics achievements in military history, a feat of engineering and organization that transformed the Middle East. American engineers took control of Iran's primitive infrastructure and transformed it in a matter of months. They inherited a single-track railway moving 200 tons daily and increased its capacity to 6,000 tons. They built highways where only camel paths had existed for centuries. They constructed assembly plants in the desert that could process 300 trucks daily, complete with testing facilities and quality control procedures that amazed visiting Soviet officials. The truck assembly plant at Andameshk became the symbol of American industrial might transplanted to the Middle East. Soviet drivers would arrive after grueling journeys from the Caucasus, receive 3 days of intensive training on American vehicles, then drive their new trucks 1,800 miles back to the front. The cultural shock was profound for soldiers accustomed to vehicles that required constant repair. Suddenly, they commanded machines that simply worked day after day without major maintenance. By mid-1943, the Persian Corridor was delivering thousands of trucks monthly with clockwork precision. The port of Khorramshahr, which had handled 50,000 tons annually before the war, was processing 250,000 tons per month. American efficiency stunned Soviet liaison officers who reported to Moscow about dock operations that unloaded ships in 48 hours, tasks that took Soviet ports 2 weeks to accomplish. The total vehicles delivered through this route reached into the tens of thousands, with estimates suggesting that nearly half of all American trucks reached the Soviet Union via Iran. The corridor operated with an efficiency that Soviet logistics officers studied intensively and tried desperately to replicate, though they lacked the industrial infrastructure and organizational culture to match American methods. The systematic approach, standardized procedures, and predictable results represented everything Soviet logistics aspired to but rarely achieved. The marriage of American trucks to Soviet rocket artillery created one of the most feared weapons of World War II. The BM-13 Katyusha rocket launcher had originally been mounted on ZIS-6 trucks, but production of this vehicle ceased in late 1941 when the factory was converted to tank production. The handful of rail-mounted and towed versions proved nearly useless in mobile warfare, sitting ducks for German counter-battery fire. The Studebaker US-6 changed everything with dramatic suddenness. Its reinforced chassis could handle the violent recoil of a full rocket salvo without structural damage. Its six-wheel drive allowed it to fire and relocate before German counterfire could arrive, turning the Katyusha from a vulnerable artillery piece into a phantom weapon that struck and vanished. The cross-country performance of the Studebaker was so superior that it became the standardized mount for all Katyusha systems in 1943, designated BM-13 and Normalizovany, standardized. More than 1,800 of these standardized Studebaker-mounted systems were manufactured by war's end. Guards formations equipped with Studebaker-mounted Katyushas achieved survival rates 400% higher than those using Soviet vehicles. The ability to shoot and scoot, fire a salvo, and relocate within 3 minutes depended entirely on reliable vehicles. Soviet trucks, when they worked at all, needed 15 minutes for the same evolution, often making them casualties of their own success, as German observers called in artillery strikes. The psychological impact matched the physical destruction. German soldiers called them Stalin's organs for their distinctive howling sound, but veteran Wehrmacht troops noted bitterly that they rode on American trucks. The standardization on American chassis revolutionized Soviet rocket artillery logistics, providing one manual, one set of parts, one type of training instead of the improvisation that had characterized earlier efforts. Analyzing production statistics reveals the mathematical impossibility of Soviet victory without American trucks. Soviet vehicle production during the war totaled approximately 46,100 vehicles from June 22, 1941, 32,300 vehicles in 1942, 41,600 vehicles in 1943, 57,400 vehicles in 1944, and 27,600 vehicles through May 1945. Total wartime Soviet truck production reached approximately 205,000 units, less than half the American contribution of 427,284 vehicles. Against this production, losses were catastrophic. Nearly 300,000 vehicles were lost in 1941 alone, with continued losses throughout the war totaling over 500,000 vehicles. Without American deliveries, the Soviet vehicle park would have shrunk to nothing by mid-1942, leaving the Red Army essentially immobilized. Every Soviet offensive after Stalingrad depended fundamentally on American wheels. By 1945, American-built vehicles comprised 33% of the Red Army's total vehicle fleet, but represented 70% of its actual transport capacity due to their superior carrying capacity and reliability. The economic dimension was equally critical. A single Studebaker US-6 cost $1,830 to produce in 1943. The Soviet Union received them free through Lend-Lease. To produce equivalent vehicles domestically would have cost the Soviet Union approximately $780 million in 1943 dollars, resources desperately needed for tank and aircraft production, plus industrial capacity the USSR simply didn't possess. Operation Migration, launched on June 23, 1944, demonstrated definitively that American trucks had transformed Soviet operational capability. This massive offensive, which destroyed German Army Group Center and inflicted 450,000 casualties, would have been impossible without American vehicles providing the logistical foundation for sustained advance. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's operational planning revealed the mathematical dependency with stark clarity. His first Belarusian front required 12,000 tons of supplies daily to maintain offensive momentum. Soviet railways could deliver supplies to depots 60 to 100 kilometers behind the lines, but from there only trucks could maintain the advance across the broken landscape of Belarus. Rokossovsky had 19,000 trucks under his command, 14,000 of them American. The speed of advance, 450 kilometers in 5 weeks, completely overwhelmed German planning, which assumed Soviet forces would need operational pauses every 100 to 150 kilometers to rebuild their logistics. Wehrmacht intelligence had calculated Soviet offensive capability based on known Soviet truck production, not realizing that American vehicles had tripled Red Army transport capacity virtually overnight. During Migration's 5 weeks of sustained offensive operations, American trucks in Soviet service carried 400,000 tons of ammunition, 300,000 tons of food and evacuated 250,000 wounded soldiers back to medical facilities. They consumed 67,000 tons of fuel, itself delivered largely by other American trucks in an endless cycle of supply. Soviet truck production for the entire year of 1944 could not have sustained this offensive for even 1 week. The contrast with earlier operations was stark and instructive. The failed Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 had stalled partly because Soviet forces outran their logistics within days, leaving tanks without fuel and infantry without ammunition. By 1944, equipped with American trucks, Soviet forces could maintain offensive momentum for weeks, turning tactical victories into strategic triumphs that reshaped the entire Eastern Front. Marshal Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most celebrated commander, left 3 separate testimonies about American aid that remained hidden until the Soviet collapse, each adding devastating details that demolished the myth of Soviet self-sufficiency brick by brick. The first testimony emerged from KGB surveillance transcripts discovered in the 1990s. In 1963, during a private conversation at his dacha, unaware of hidden microphones planted by paranoid security services, Zhukov stated with characteristic bluntness, "People say that the Allies didn't help us. But it cannot be denied that the Americans sent us material without which we could not have formed our reserves or continued the war. Without American trucks, we wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with." The second testimony came in interviews with writer Konstantin Simonov conducted between 1965 and 1966, tape recordings that remained suppressed until 1990. Zhukov was even more explicit in private conversation. "Without American studs, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. To a considerable degree, they provided our front transport." The use of studs, the affectionate Soviet nickname for Studebakers, revealed how deeply these American vehicles had penetrated Soviet military culture. The third account appeared in Zhukov's unpublished manuscript, seized by authorities in 1969 and locked in archives until 1992. Analyzing the Battle of Berlin, Zhukov wrote candidly about the critical importance of American trucks in delivering 2.2 million artillery shells in just 2 weeks, possible only with American vehicles making continuous supply runs under fire while Soviet trucks broke down or were destroyed by German counter-battery fire. Nikita Khrushchev's secretly recorded memoirs, smuggled to the West in 1970, contained perhaps the most comprehensive admission about Soviet dependence on American aid. His testimony was later authenticated through voice analysis and corroborated by multiple other sources after the Soviet collapse, providing an unvarnished look at Soviet wartime reality. I would like to express my candid opinion about Stalin's views on whether the Red Army and the Soviet Union could have coped with Nazi Germany and survived the war without aid from the United States and Britain, Khrushchev stated in recordings that would have cost him his life if discovered. He continued with devastating honesty. He stated bluntly that if the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. If we had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, we could not have stood up against Germany's pressure, and we would have lost the war. Khrushchev specifically addressed the truck question that lay at the heart of Soviet logistics. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion, but I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me. Our losses would have been colossal because we would have had no maneuverability. This same Khrushchev, as Soviet premier, would publicly declare that the Soviet Union had accomplished victory entirely with its own resources, a contradiction that epitomized Soviet schizophrenia about American aid throughout the Cold War period. Soviet mechanics who maintained American trucks understood firsthand the technological gap between American and Soviet automotive engineering. American engines used lightweight aluminum pistons that transferred heat efficiently and lasted longer. Soviet engines relied on heavy cast iron pistons that wore out quickly and reduced engine efficiency. American trucks came equipped with sophisticated oil filters that removed contaminants. Soviet trucks relied on primitive settling tanks that rarely worked effectively. American vehicles featured sealed wheel bearings that could last 50,000 kilometers without maintenance. Soviet bearings, when available at all, lasted 5,000 kilometers if mechanics were fortunate. The spare parts system amazed Soviet mechanics accustomed to cannibalization and improvisation. Americans sent detailed catalogs showing every part with specific numbers, order by number, and the exact part would arrive. The Soviet system required cannibalizing broken vehicles or manufacturing parts by hand from whatever materials were available. American trucks included safety equipment that Soviet designers had never considered necessary: safety glass that didn't shatter into deadly fragments, mirrors on both sides for visibility, backup lights for nighttime operations, horns operable with one hand while maintaining control. These features saved countless lives and improved operational efficiency in ways that Soviet planners were only beginning to understand. Beyond immediate military impact, American trucks revolutionized Soviet automotive thinking for decades to come. Soviet engineers studying American vehicles learned lessons that influenced post-war Soviet truck design well into the 1960s. The ZIS 150, the Soviet Union's first post-war mass-produced truck, was essentially a Soviet interpretation of American design principles learned from careful study of Studebakers and other Lend-Lease vehicles. American trucks introduced an entirely new maintenance culture previously unknown in Soviet practice: preventive maintenance schedules, systematic inspections, standardized parts catalogs. These concepts came directly from studying American vehicles and would influence Soviet industrial development for an entire generation, though implementation often fell short of American standards. The Soviet failure in the 1939-40 Winter War against Finland had exposed catastrophic logistics weaknesses that would prove prophetic. Unable to supply troops operating just 150 kilometers from Leningrad, the Red Army suffered 126,875 dead and 264,908 wounded against Finnish forces one-tenth their size. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's post-war analysis identified truck shortage as a critical factor in the humiliating performance. Soviet forces had enjoyed overwhelming numerical superiority, but couldn't concentrate their forces effectively due to transport limitations. Artillery pieces sat unused for lack of prime movers. Infantry advances stalled when supplies couldn't reach forward positions. Medical evacuation proved so inadequate that wounded soldiers froze to death waiting for transport that never came. By 1944, American trucks had solved the fundamental problems exposed in Finland with devastating effectiveness. The Soviet offensive against Finnish forces in June 1944 succeeded precisely because American vehicles maintained reliable supply lines through the same terrain that had defeated Soviet logistics 4 years earlier. The contrast was dramatic and unmistakable to any officer who had participated in both campaigns. Soviet propaganda often claimed that railways, not trucks, were the key to logistics, deliberately minimizing American vehicle importance in post-war histories. Declassified General Staff studies revealed why this claim was historically false and operationally impossible. During their retreat, German forces systematically destroyed 65,000 kilometers of track, 13,000 bridges, and 4,100 stations in a scorched earth campaign designed to paralyze Soviet logistics. Soviet railway troops, working under constant air attack and artillery fire, could restore about 20 kilometers of track daily under combat conditions. However, these hastily restored single-track lines could handle only 6 to 8 trains daily versus 40 to 50 trains on intact double-track routes. More critically, railways ended at fixed points determined by geography and German destruction patterns. The final 50 to 100 kilometers from railheads to combat units required trucks exclusively. No trucks meant no supplies at the front, regardless of railway capacity behind the lines. The Germans had learned this lesson fatally during their own offensive operations. Their excellent railway engineers kept pace initially, but lack of sufficient trucks meant supplies accumulated uselessly at railheads while combat units starved for ammunition and fuel. While Studebakers captured Soviet imagination and dominated the numbers, the full range of American vehicles proved equally important to Soviet success. The 51,503 Willys Jeeps revolutionized reconnaissance and command functions, allowing Soviet officers to maintain contact with subordinate units in ways previously impossible. The 69,000 Dodge 3/4-ton trucks provided tactical mobility for infantry squads, while 47,000 Chevrolet 1.5-ton vehicles served as divisional workhorses handling everything from ammunition resupply to medical evacuation. Marshal Ivan Konev noted in his private journals that jeeps allowed real-time battle control, with commanders visiting multiple divisions daily and accelerating the command cycle to provide decisive advantages over German forces still relying on motorcycles and staff cars. The psychological impact on Soviet troops was equally important. Seeing their commanders regularly at forward positions boosted morale and improved tactical coordination. The systematic integration of American vehicles into Soviet operations created synergies that multiplied their individual effectiveness. Studebakers hauled heavy supplies to forward depots, Chevrolets distributed them to company level, Dodges moved tactical supplies to platoon positions, and Jeeps maintained communications throughout the system. This integrated approach represented a revolution in Soviet military logistics that would influence their operations for decades. The systematic suppression of Lend-Lease acknowledgement began even before the war ended, as political considerations trumped historical accuracy. In February 1945, the State Defense Committee issued Secret Order Number 7572 with crystal clear instructions: all photographs of foreign equipment to be censored from publication. Soviet industry alone must be credited with victory. This directive initiated a comprehensive 40-year campaign to systematically erase American trucks from Soviet war memory. Photo sensors painted over American vehicles in official photographs, replacing them with Soviet equipment. Films showing American trucks were edited extensively or destroyed entirely. Veterans' memoirs were censored line by line to remove any references to foreign aid, with editors maintaining detailed lists of prohibited terms and acceptable substitutes. The suppression extended far beyond mere photographs to statistical manipulation on a massive scale. The official 1960 Soviet history claimed that Lend-Lease represented only 4% of Soviet wartime production, achieved through accounting manipulation that compared American deliveries to total Soviet production, including civilian goods, using ruble values that systematically undervalued American equipment while inflating Soviet production figures. When veterans submitted memoirs describing their experiences with American vehicles, editors systematically replaced specific references with vague terms designed to obscure foreign origins. Studebaker became simply truck. American vehicles became our vehicles. Entire passages were rewritten to eliminate any hint of foreign assistance, creating a thoroughly sanitized version of wartime experience that bore little resemblance to historical reality. As Cold War tensions escalated throughout the late 1940s, the suppression intensified dramatically. By 1948, Politburo member Nikolai Voznesensky issued official reports claiming that Lend-Lease represented barely 4% of Soviet production while simultaneously denouncing America as leader of the anti-democratic camp. This became the rigid official line for 4 decades, enforced through censorship, intimidation, and outright falsification of historical records. Soviet historians who knew the truth faced an impossible choice that would define their careers and potentially their lives: repeat the official lies or risk everything by telling the truth. Most chose safety over accuracy, producing histories that credited Soviet industry alone with victory while ignoring the massive American contribution that had made victory possible. The few who attempted to present honest accounts found their work rejected, their careers destroyed, and in some cases, their freedom threatened. The distortion of history affected an entire generation's education about their nation's greatest triumph. Soviet school children learned that their country had defeated Hitler essentially alone, with minimal outside assistance. Textbooks contained detailed statistics about Soviet tank and aircraft production, but made no mention of the trucks that carried fuel to those tanks and ammunition to those aircraft. Museums proudly displayed captured German equipment but carefully hid American vehicles, sometimes in storage rooms where they collected dust rather than challenged the official narrative. War memorials celebrated Soviet tanks rolling into Berlin but never mentioned the American trucks that carried the ammunition for those tanks as guns. Victory parades featured Soviet soldiers marching in formation but omitted any reference to the American boots on their feet or the American food in their stomachs. The systematic erasure was so complete that many Soviet citizens genuinely believed their nation had defeated the most powerful military machine in history entirely through their own efforts. The psychological impact of this deception extended far beyond historical accuracy. It created a distorted understanding of international cooperation and the role of allies in achieving victory. Young Soviets grew up believing that their country had triumphed through isolation and self-reliance, making it difficult for them to understand the complex realities of international relations in the post-war world. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy finally permitted honest discussion of previously forbidden topics, including the true extent of American aid during the war. In 1989, Military History Journal published the Tehran Conference transcripts showing Stalin's private admission about American aid, creating a sensation that reverberated throughout Soviet society. The public reaction was explosive and deeply emotional. Readers discovered that their entire understanding of the war, the foundational myth of Soviet power, was built on systematic lies maintained for nearly half a century. The revelation struck at the heart of Soviet identity, forcing millions to reconsider everything they thought they knew about their nation's greatest achievement. Veterans, finally free to speak truthfully after decades of enforced silence, began sharing stories that had been hidden for 45 years. At a 1990 Moscow reunion of wartime drivers, former soldiers stood one by one to testify about their American trucks, revealing personal experiences that contradicted decades of official propaganda. Many wept as they spoke, not from shame, but from relief at finally being able to honor the complete truth about their service. The emotional catharsis was profound and often painful. Veterans who had been forced to lie about their wartime experience for decades suddenly found themselves able to acknowledge the American contribution that had made their victories possible. The revelation was particularly poignant for men who had driven American trucks into Berlin but had been forbidden to speak of them for the rest of their lives. Archival revelations following glasnost were nothing short of stunning for historians and the general public alike. Researchers discovered that Soviet authorities had maintained dual bookkeeping systems throughout the war, real statistics for internal planning purposes and false ones for public consumption. The real numbers showed that American trucks comprised 70% of Soviet transport capacity by 1945, making them indispensable to virtually every major operation. Dr. Boris Solovyov, examining newly opened archives with the excitement of an archaeologist uncovering ancient treasures, calculated definitively that removing American trucks from Soviet military equations would cause every offensive after Stalingrad to fail catastrophically. His research demonstrated mathematically what veterans had known intuitively. The Red Army marched to Berlin on American boots and rode on American trucks. The documentation was overwhelming in its comprehensiveness and devastating in its implications for Soviet historical mythology. Internal military reports, logistic studies, and private correspondence all confirmed the same basic truth. American vehicles had been absolutely essential to Soviet victory, not merely helpful or supplementary as official histories had claimed. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery of extensive surveillance records showing that Soviet leaders had privately acknowledged American aid's importance while publicly denying it. KGB transcripts revealed conversations where the same officials who praised Soviet self-sufficiency in public speeches privately admitted their complete dependence on American supplies. The Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945 provided the ultimate demonstration of American trucks' importance to Soviet operations. The logistics requirements were staggering beyond imagination. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and 41,600 artillery pieces, all requiring continuous supply across German territory systematically destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces. Marshal Zhukov's First Belarusian Front alone required 25,000 tons of supplies daily to maintain its assault on the Nazi capital. His logistics network included 22,000 trucks, of which 16,000 were American-built vehicles that had crossed oceans and continents to participate in the final battle of the European War. The ammunition expenditure during the first week alone, 2.5 million artillery shells, required trucks making continuous runs under heavy German fire. Each American truck averaged 4 supply runs daily over a 100-kilometer round trip through rubble-strewn streets and shell-cratered roads. Soviet trucks, when operational at all, managed one run before suffering mechanical breakdown or combat damage. The reliability differential was so significant that Soviet logistics officers privately planned all critical missions around American vehicles, using Soviet trucks only for secondary tasks where failure wouldn't compromise the operation. Even in victory's moment, the dependency remained absolute and undeniable. The victory parade through Berlin's shattered streets was accomplished primarily with American vehicles, chosen not for propaganda purposes, but because they were the most presentable and most reliable. Soviet forces conquered Hitler's capital while riding in Roosevelt's trucks, an irony that would have been inconceivable to the German defenders who had dismissed American industrial capacity just 4 years earlier. The complete accounting of American aid, finally revealed after the Soviet collapse, was staggering in its scope and generosity. The vehicle deliveries included 427,284 trucks and jeeps, 13,300 combat vehicles, 35,170 motorcycles, and 2,328 ordnance service vehicles. Supporting materials included 2.7 million tons of petroleum products, 4.5 million tons of food, 15.4 million pairs of boots, 1,911 steam locomotives, and 11,075 railroad cars. The vehicle deliveries alone represented more trucks than Germany had produced during the entire war, enough transport to completely motorize 60 rifle divisions or supply an army group for sustained offensive operations. By war's end, American vehicles had transported 60% of all Soviet ammunition, moved 70% of all fuel, evacuated 65% of wounded soldiers, and towed 58% of artillery pieces. These numbers represented not just statistical quantities but human realities. Millions of Soviet soldiers who ate American food, wore American boots, rode in American trucks, and fired American ammunition in their struggle against fascism. The systematic denial of this contribution dishonored not just American generosity, but the memory of Soviet soldiers who had benefited from international cooperation in their darkest hour. In the immediate post-war period, grateful Soviet officials proposed monuments to American aid that would acknowledge the international cooperation that had made victory possible. Marshal Zhukov himself suggested a memorial to the Allied arsenal of democracy, envisioning a tribute that would honor the trucks, jeeps, and supplies that had rolled across oceans to save the Soviet Union in its hour of greatest need. The Communist Party leadership rejected all such proposals with increasing vehemence as Cold War tensions escalated. For 45 years, no monument would acknowledge the American trucks' crucial role in Soviet victory. The absence of any memorial reflected a deeper tragedy, the systematic theft of historical memory from an entire population. Millions of Soviet citizens grew up believing their nation had defeated Hitler entirely through its own efforts, never knowing that American wheels had carried their grandfathers to victory. Only in 2004 was a modest Lend-Lease memorial finally unveiled in Murmansk, the Arctic port where so many American convoys had arrived during the war's darkest days. Even then, controversy erupted immediately. Communist Party veterans denounced the memorial as falsification of history, while others argued it was long overdue recognition of international friendship. The debate revealed how deeply the lies had penetrated Soviet consciousness, making it difficult for some Russians to accept the truth about their own history. As the last veterans pass away, their testimonies become precious historical documents that cannot be replaced or recreated. At a 2005 gathering in Moscow, the remaining drivers who had operated American trucks during the war formed what they called the Studebaker Brotherhood to preserve the true history of their service before it disappeared forever with their generation. These elderly men, many in their 80s, had spent decades carrying the burden of forbidden truth. They had been forced to remain silent, while official historians credited Soviet industry alone with victory, knowing from personal experience that American trucks had been indispensable to every major operation. Their formation of the Brotherhood represented both an act of historical preservation and personal liberation after decades of enforced silence. The Brotherhood collected photographs that had been hidden for 60 years, showing American vehicles with Soviet markings operating on every front from Leningrad to Berlin. These images, carefully preserved in family albums and basement storage rooms, provided visual proof that contradicted decades of official propaganda. Many families had kept such photographs despite knowing that possession of them could have resulted in arrest during Stalin's paranoid final years. Their final statement, signed by 200 veterans at their last major gathering, declared with the dignity of men who had served their country faithfully, "We rode American trucks to victory. We ate American food. We fired American ammunition. This is not diminishment of Soviet sacrifice. 27 million of our people died. But truth honors their memory better than lies. American trucks helped save our motherland." The statement represented more than historical correction. It was a moral declaration that truth serves memory better than mythology, regardless of political convenience. These veterans understood that acknowledging international cooperation did not diminish Soviet sacrifice, but rather placed it in its proper historical context as part of a global struggle against fascism. Today, as Russia again revises World War II history for political purposes, the Lend-Lease story carries renewed relevance that extends far beyond historical scholarship. Modern Russian textbooks minimize American aid even more systematically than Soviet ones, as part of a broader campaign to restore national pride through historical mythology that serves contemporary political needs rather than historical accuracy. The parallels with wartime propaganda are striking and deeply concerning to historians who remember the previous campaign of falsification. Official Russian media presents the Soviet Union as having defeated Hitler essentially single-handedly, with minimal foreign assistance. This narrative serves current political purposes by promoting ideas of Russian self-sufficiency and questioning the value of international cooperation, but it dishonors the memory of both American generosity and Soviet sacrifice. Yet the mathematical facts remain unchanged and unchangeable, regardless of political manipulation. The documented delivery of 427,284 American vehicles, more than double Soviet wartime production of 205,000 trucks, cannot be erased from history. The testimony of Stalin, Khrushchev, and Zhukov, preserved in multiple archives across different countries, cannot be denied or explained away through political rhetoric. The truth serves as a powerful reminder that international cooperation, not isolation, defeated fascism in its most virulent form. The American trucks that carried Soviet soldiers to victory were products of democracy's arsenal, shared freely with an ally despite fundamental ideological differences that would later divide the world. This cooperation represented humanity at its best, nations setting aside political differences to confront a common threat to civilization itself. The story of American trucks in Soviet service transcends military logistics to become a testament to several enduring truths about war, politics, and human nature. It demonstrates conclusively that industrial capacity wins modern wars as surely as courage and sacrifice, showing how productive capability can be as decisive as tactical brilliance or strategic insight. The systematic suppression and eventual revelation of this truth illustrates how authoritarian regimes manipulate historical memory to serve political purposes, often at the cost of honoring those who serve. The 45-year campaign to deny American contributions dishonored not just American generosity, but also the Soviet soldiers who had benefited from international cooperation in their struggle for survival. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows how truth ultimately emerges despite official suppression, preserved by witnesses who refuse to let lies replace reality. The veterans who formed the Studebaker Brotherhood understood that historical accuracy matters more than political convenience, and their courage in speaking truth to power helped restore historical memory that had been systematically distorted. The 427,284 American trucks and jeeps that reached the Soviet Union represented far more than statistics in a ledger book. They constituted the margin between victory and defeat on the Eastern Front, transforming the Red Army from a World War I-style force dependent on railways and horses into a mechanized army capable of sustained offensive operations across continental distances that had previously been impossible to contemplate. Soviet leaders knew this truth with absolute certainty, regardless of what they later claimed in public. Stalin's admission at Tehran that, without American machines, we would have lost the war represented one of the most honest moments in his brutal career. Zhukov's confession that without American trucks, Soviet forces wouldn't have had anything to pull our artillery with came from the man who understood Soviet logistics better than any other commander. Khrushchev's acknowledgement that without American aid, the Soviet Union could not have withstood German pressure reflected the private reality that contradicted decades of public mythology. For 45 years, the Soviet Union maintained a false narrative that served political purposes but dishonored historical truth. Photographs were doctored with systematic thoroughness, memoirs were censored line by line, and statistics were falsified to create an alternative reality that bore no resemblance to actual wartime experience. The Communist Party systematically stole from its own people the true history of their victory, replacing authentic memory with mythology designed to serve political needs rather than honor sacrifice. Only with glasnost did the full truth finally emerge from archives, recordings, and testimonies that had been suppressed for nearly half a century. The evidence proved overwhelmingly that American trucks didn't just assist the Soviet war effort, they enabled it completely. The Studebakers that Soviet soldiers affectionately called Studebakers and nicknamed go-anywhere vehicles were as essential to victory as the T-34 tanks celebrated in every memorial and museum. The suppression and eventual revelation of this truth carries lessons that extend far beyond military history into fundamental questions about truth, power, and historical memory. It demonstrates with crystal clarity how authoritarian regimes systematically manipulate memory to serve political purposes, how institutional necessities can override historical accuracy, and how truth ultimately emerges despite decades of official suppression and intimidation. Today, the mathematical fact remains as solid as the steel from which those trucks were built. Soviet forces rode to victory in Berlin on American trucks, carried by vehicles that had crossed oceans and continents to serve in humanity's struggle against fascism. The arsenal of democracy defeated the Wehrmacht not just with weapons of war, but with the wheels of industry, 427,284 of them, representing American generosity and Soviet gratitude that would later be forgotten by politics but preserved by truth. The American trucks that transformed the Red Army represent something far greater than mere machines or military hardware. They symbolized how industrial democracy's productive capacity, when shared freely even with ideological opponents, proved decisive in humanity's struggle against the forces of fascism and tyranny. The systematic generosity represented by Lend-Lease demonstrated that democratic nations could set aside political differences when confronted with threats to civilization itself. The Soviet generals who privately admitted they would have lost without American trucks spoke a truth that transcends political considerations and touches fundamental realities about modern warfare. Victory in the 20th century's greatest conflict required not just courage, sacrifice, and tactical skill, but the marriage of bravery with industrial might on a scale that only democratic nations could sustain over years of global conflict. In the end, those sturdy Studebakers that survived decades of harsh service in the Soviet Union outlasted the lies told about them by political authorities who valued mythology over truth. The veterans who drove them knew the reality, the documents preserved the facts, and history ultimately recorded the complete story despite decades of systematic suppression. Without American trucks, there would have been no Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, a conclusion supported by overwhelming documentary evidence, statistical analysis, and the private admissions of every major Soviet leader who participated in the war. The wheels of America's arsenal of democracy carried not just military supplies across continents and oceans, but the hopes of nations struggling for survival against the most evil regime in human history. The final irony of this story lies in the fact that American generosity and industrial might help create the very Soviet power that would spend 45 years systematically denying the American contribution to its survival. Yet truth, like those reliable American engines that continued running long after their Soviet counterparts had failed, endures beyond political manipulation and ideological distortion. The Soviet generals who privately acknowledged their dependence on American trucks spoke with the authority of men who had commanded armies and understood the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. They knew that victory required more than courage and sacrifice. It demanded the industrial capacity that only America could provide when the world's survival hung in the balance. Marshal Zhukov's final assessment, preserved despite decades of censorship, captured the essential truth with characteristic bluntness. Without American Studebakers, we could have dragged our artillery nowhere. In those simple words lay the key to understanding how the Eastern Front was won and why the Red Army was able to drive the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. The answer rolled on American wheels, carried American supplies, and represented American friendship extended to an ally in humanity's darkest hour.